Today's story is Saint Nicholas and the Nine Gold Coins, written by Jim Forrest and illustrated by Vladislav Andrejev. Once upon a time, there was a boy named Nicholas. Today we call him Saint Nicholas, but when he was growing up, everyone just called him Nick. Nick lived in a town called Patara, where ships came and went every day. You should have seen them. They were made of brightly painted wood with tall masts that seemed to touch the sky and had sails of every color. The men who made up the crews had an endless supply of tales to tell of their close encounters with fabulous creatures, from sea monsters big as islands to mermaids whose voices could pull a sailor beneath the waves. The sailors also filled Nick's imagination with visions of distant ports and great cities: Alexandria, Antioch, Sidon, Tripoli, Carthage, Rome, Syracuse, Ravenna. Such beautiful names, so many places, all so far away. But at the same time, as close as any ship floating in Patara's harbor. It was Nick's dream to become a sailor and travel to the faraway ports that were beyond the horizon, yet shared the same sea in which he and his friends so often swam. In the meantime, he asked every sailor he met, "Where have you been? What was it like?" Nick's uncle was an important man in Patara. He was the bishop. But for Nick, he was also both father and mother, as Nick's own parents had died early in life. It was his uncle who taught him to read and write. It pleased Nick that he had been named after his uncle. Everyone respected the bishop, not only because he helped each person who came to him in need, but also for his faith and courage. As a young man, Nick's uncle had been beaten and imprisoned just for being a Christian. The two of them often went for walks together. His uncle enjoyed listening to Nick retell stories he had heard from sailors. He had stories to tell as well from the gospel, some from his own experience as bishop. "You don't have to go to sea to have adventures," he told Nick. "I promise you, whoever lives according to the gospel will have greater adventures than meeting sea monsters or hearing mermaids sing." For Nick, just being with his uncle was an adventure and an education. Nearly every day his uncle found time to visit the sick. Nick was often at his side during these visits. "It's a never-ending journey to getting to know people," said Nick's uncle. "Everyone has a story, and no two stories are alike." Nick thought of Mark, a neighbor who had lost a leg in an accident on board ship. His uncle not only changed Mark's bandages day after day, but he also changed Mark's mind. After his accident, Mark had wanted to die. "My life is over," he said. "There is nothing for me to do." But Nick's uncle found a job for Mark mending nets, which helped Mark want to stay alive. "Restoring hope can be a resurrection," his uncle told him. Nick also noticed how his uncle would sometimes quietly leave a coin as he was saying goodbye to those he visited. "You know what Jesus said," his uncle explained. "Sell what you have and give it to the poor." Nick knew that he noticed how his uncle would sometimes... I'm sorry. I knew I shouldn't have.
Just keep going.
Okay.
We can cut this part.
Okay,
it's
good.
an amazing thing about TV.
Nick knew that his uncle's house, there was a special chest where his uncle kept a sack of gold coins that had been kept for him by his parents. Nick's inheritance. "Should I give the coins to the poor?" he asked his uncle. "It's good that you think about these things," his uncle replied. "But you're too young to make such decisions." By the time Nick was 14, he still had his dream of being a sailor, but he also pondered the example of his uncle's life. Perhaps the voyages God wanted him to take in life weren't by ship to distant ports, but to people nearby. One evening, when Nick was walking past a neighbor's front door, he heard a woman weeping. This was the home of a husband and wife whose 3 daughters were old enough to marry, but not one had married yet. Nick knew about their problem. The family had no money. In those days, it was the custom that the father whose daughter was getting married had to provide money or property to help the couple set up a new household. This was called a dowry. But because his neighbor's family was so poor, it seemed none of the daughters would ever be able to marry and start a family of their own. Nick wondered if he shouldn't tell his uncle. Perhaps he would find a way to help. But it seemed to Nick that God has put this problem in his hands and no one else's. His uncle had given him an example of what to do. Nick made a secret decision. He knew where the key was to the chest where his uncle kept the gold coins left for him by his parents. And he had discovered that 3 gold coins would be enough for a dowry. Just 3 coins would make it possible for the oldest daughter, Sophia, to marry. How happy she would be. One night, when his uncle was away, Nick opened the chest, found the bag with his inheritance, took 3 coins, put them in a cloth sack and tied it closed. In the dark of night, he threw the sack through an open window into his neighbor's house, and slipped away as quietly as a cat. Days later, the news swept through the town that Sophia was going to marry Anthony, a friend of Nick's. It was a good match, everyone said. 2 fine young people, perfect for each other. Sophia's parents said it was a miracle. A sack of 3 gold coins had been thrown into their home while they were sleeping. Perhaps an angel sent it, said Sophia's mother, her face wet with tears of joy. It was hard to keep from telling his uncle what he had done, but hadn't his uncle often said that giving is most pleasing to God when only God knows the giver? "Don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing," his uncle said, quoting the gospel. "Let God be the only witness." The problem was that there were still 2 unmarried sisters, Macrina and Zoe. It had been easy giving 3 coins, but 6 more gold coins would mean that very little of his inheritance would remain safely locked up in the chest. It took 3 months, but at last Nick found the courage to throw a second sack with 3 coins in his neighbor's house. Not long afterward, Macrina married Paul, and still no one knew where the money had come from. There was still Zoe, the youngest daughter. Must Nick help her as well? Hadn't he done enough? Shouldn't he keep the money left in the chest for his own future needs? One day he happened to see Zoe walking home from the market and noticed the sadness in her eyes. What right had he to worry about his own future when Zoe's needs were here and now? Hadn't Jesus said, "Don't worry about tomorrow"? That night, Nick took 3 more coins from the chest. With only the light of the moon to guide him, Nick tossed the last sack through the window. But this time someone spotted him. Zoe's father had been waiting in the shadows. "Ah, so it is you, Nick," he said. "But how is this possible? You're so young, that a boy should care so much about our troubles. It's a miracle." "I'm only following my uncle's example," whispered Nick. "Please don't tell anyone." Zoe's father promised not to tell, but of course he told his wife, who felt it necessary to tell her brother, who told his best friend, who whispered it to his next-door neighbor, who mentioned it to her husband. Each person who knew the secret thought of one other person who could be trusted not to tell. Before many days passed, everyone in Patara knew that Nick had done it. At last, the story reached his uncle's ears. "I'm so proud of you, Nick," the bishop told his nephew. "And I know your parents would be too. You cared more about your neighbor than yourself." Many years passed, then centuries. But the tale has never been forgotten. The story of Nicolas, who wanted to be a sailor, but who became Saint Nicholas, Bishop of Myra, a great wonder worker who, when he was only a boy, gave away 9 gold coins. The end.